The preeminent and highly acclaimed Chris Claremont created the Marvel villain known as Mr. Sinister. Initially, Claremont and artist Dave Cockrum wanted Mr. Sinister to be an ancient being trapped in the body of an 11-year-old boy. As he slowly aged over thousands of years, he was to be named, act, and look like everything that would scare a child. This was abandoned, and what follows is the tale of the notorious Mr. Sinister. At first, though, not much was known about the, quote, enigmatic mastermind calling himself Mr. Sinister, but eventually the Sinister saga came out from the darkness. Dr. Nathaniel Essex was born in the 1800s in the Victorian age of London, England, to Admiral Erasmus Essex and Mary Essex. Nathaniel grew up, attended Oxford, and became a renowned and prominent scientist of the time, championing Darwinism, evolution, and Darwin's survival of the fittest concept from his On the Origin of Species book, though he did believe Darwin to be hindered by moral constraints. By the 1850s, Essex became a thought leader of the Age of Enlightenment. Eventually, Essex married and had a wife named Rebecca. They ended up having a child named Adam, and when Adam died from a genetic mutation at a mere 4 years old, Essex became even more obsessed with the idea of mutation and genetic manipulation. Essex withdrew from Rebecca and began to spiral to a very dark place. He told her once that there is no God, but that if his theories were correct, that humans might one day evolve into gods. He identified a latent mutant gene that he wanted to call the Essex factor. One time he presented a horrific abomination to the Royal Society of London, a monster he sewed and Frankenstein together with human, animal, and inorganic parts. They said he went too far, but Essex wanted to go farther. He linked up with a group of human traffickers called the Marauders to buy living people and body parts for his experiments. He even dug up his own deceased child and brought Adam's body back to his lab. This all drew the attention of another mutant interested in his work. That was the blue and gray Egyptian mutant Apocalypse. It was around this time that a time-traveling Cyclops and Jean Grey were approached by Sanctity of the Ascani and tasked with finding Mr. Sinister's Milbury house back in time, as that was the site where forking paths of destiny would meet, and so they were there to stop that from happening, to stop Sinister and Apocalypse from meeting. By the time they got there, Sinister and Apocalypse had gone to Braddock and Shaw at the Hellfire Club for assistance. Jean Grey found her way to Essex to try to get him to stop working with Apocalypse, to no avail. Rebecca Essex then lost their second child at that time, and so Nathaniel ran back to her begging for her forgiveness. She looked at him and said no, that he'd become twisted and cruel after Adam died. She called him utterly and contemptibly sinister, just as she too died, and with that, Essex went beyond the pale. He went to Apocalypse to accept Apocalypse's offer, and so Essex was subjected to Apocalypse's alien transformation technology, where afterwards Essex took his wife's last word as his new name. Dr. Nathaniel Essex was now Mr. Sinister, and he was imbued with various powers, including immortality. Essex became a ghastly pale and was draped in regal garb fitting of a disciple of Apocalypse. They both retreated to Apocalypse's alien sanctuary deep beneath London. Not long after that, Sinister went to America and opened the Essex Clinic in New York, where he worked under the name Nathaniel Milbury, named after his old house in London, taking in even more human test subjects for his experiments. He took one test subject named Amanda Mueller and made her marry Daniel Summers, still intent on testing the Summers bloodline. Essex had her give birth and hand over the baby multiple times during that time period. During this time also, Chandra, aka Red Death, sent Gambit and Courier back in time to fix the past. The Thieves Guild ended up being captured by Dr. Milbury, so Gambit had to cut a deal with the Doctor, getting the Guild people back in exchange for information about Apocalypse. Mr. Sinister infused Courier's power to his own to aid Gambit in defeating Chandra and to erase the minds and memory of the Thieves Guild. After this, Mr. Sinister returned to Milbury House in England and continued his work. However, he started to devolve to become more primitive and feral. One time Mystique was with Destiny, also back in time, and then out as Sherlock Holmes, and she found Sinister naked in the streets of London, so fake Sherlock investigated the attack. When he went back home, Sinister was now sickly and frail. He was sent to Bethlehem Royal Hospital, where he was imprisoned. However, he himself ended up being murdered. Mystique had always wondered how she had witnessed the murder, but Essex had seemingly survived. And then they found the answer. Destiny found cloning tanks at Milbury House whose clones, identified with playing card symbols, were to fight in a survival of the fittest game for the successor. The one with a diamond on his forehead won and went on as Mr. Sinister, believing himself to be the original. He went to New York and started working as Dr. Stasis while the others disappeared on the wind. Dr. Stasis would later become head of Oblivion Institute and chairperson at Orcus. At the turn of the century, Apocalypse arose from his sleep once more and checked on how his disciple Essex was progressing with his research on the Techno-organic virus. Mr. Sinister gave it to Apocalypse, but Mr. Sinister ended up giving the virus to Apocalypse, but instead of killing him, it only weakened him. So Apocalypse went back to hibernate and heal. Meanwhile, Essex got to work on making a mutant that could take on Apocalypse, and that mutant would later become Cable. Around the same time, Mr. Sinister had expanded now to being truly global, with labs and facilities and homes all around Earth. In 1907, he was in Canada when a guy named Logan killed one of his bears. So Mr. Sinister sent his marauders to hunt down Wolverine. After he was captured, Wolverine was dissected and tortured by Essex. A couple years later, Essex was at the Ravencroft Institute as Dr. Essex, and with help from Sabretooth, captured Wolverine again and went to work on him yet again. Dr. Russell freed Logan, and so Essex ended up leaving Ravencroft. Sometime after that, and another scientist named Herbert Wyndham studied the works of Dr. Essex and used that knowledge on his quest on Wundagore Mountain to becoming the High Evolutionary. At one time, Sinister slipped Wyndham what he needed to fulfill his destiny. During World War II, Essex worked as a scientist at the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he even scared the Germans, earning the nickname Nosferatu. This was at the same time that Magneto was captive there. He also made a compound during World War II using Namor the Submariner's DNA that he called N2, and he brought his new bioweapon to bear on the invaders, and it was Captain America who took out N2. We later learned that Professor Thornton found Essex concentration camp work, and this became the foundation for the Weapons Plus program, a program that also created Captain America and other weapons like Weapon X, Luke Cage, Typhoid Mary, Huntsman, Phantom X, and later through Rice's efforts, X-23. That was the same guy who also found Essex's Ravencroft facilities and teamed up with Dracula to cure vampires, and then ended up using the monsters there to test his Weapons Plus subjects. From his time at Essex Clinic, his subject Amanda came to be head of a secret government project called the Black Womb Project, headed up by Sinister himself, though he was back to his Nathan Milbury name. The project had experimented on thousands of infants and children over the years, including the progeny of project members like Kurt Marco and Brian Xavier, fathers to Kane Marco and Charles Xavier, old Chuck. After World War II, Sinister found work as a professor at Oxford University, teaching genetics and biophysics to students like a young Charles Xavier, who'd grown up since they met at Black Womb along with Moira McTaggart. Shortly after this, Sinister moved to 1930s Los Angeles and lived under the name Nathan Essex. A little while after that, a private jet owned by Major Christopher Summers came under attack by the alien Shi'ar Empire, and so young Scott and Alex Summers were forced to jump from the plane. Alex's parachute failed to open, and so Scott, who's Cyclops of the X-Men, used his optic blast to slow their descent. It worked, but the massive discharge of energy registered on Mr. Sinister's mutant power scanners. He found Scott and determined that the Summers boys were mutants once he visited them after they fell from the sky. Though they were imprisoned by the Shi'ar Empire, the Summers' parents were believed dead, and so Mr. Sinister took them both and put them in an orphanage that he controlled, which was located in Nebraska. This was a sinister place, pun intended, which held many mutants prisoner in the sublevels. Sinister was studying and experimenting on Scott and eventually put a mental block in Scott's mind, which would block him from using his optic power until he could control it better. And while he continued to work with Scott, Mr. Sinister had Alex adopted, though he still kept an eye on him through the years. Mr. Sinister also had Scott wear ruby quartz glasses to block the blasts. Later on, and since Cyclops escaped from him, Essex acquired a DNA sample from Jean Grey and used this to make a clone of Jean. When the Phoenix Force came to Earth and replaced Jean with itself, it stole a part of Jean's consciousness. So when the Phoenix Force was finally defeated, that part of Jean's consciousness then went into Sinister's clone, and the clone awakened, now called Madeline Pryor. Sinister inserted false memories into Madeline Pryor and made her past life that of a pilot. Sinister had her flying the Summers' grandparents in Alaska, which led to his clone meeting Scott and falling in love, all part of his plan. He ultimately wanted them to have a child together that he would steal. This was foiled when the real Jean Grey returned and Scott left to join Jean and X-Factor. Mr. Sinister quickly went to work covering his tracks and anything that would lead investigators back to his clone and ultimately back to himself. After he ended up perfecting cloning technology, Essex opened a base in the South Pacific where he further developed his technology, creating lead legions, an entire army of clones of himself to continue that work, and that place was called Bar Sinister. After that, a variant of Hank McCoy called Dark Beast was using Sinister's tech and ended up playing with the Morlocks. When Mr. Sinister learned of this, he brought his marauders to bear on the Morlocks and mutant kind during an event known as the Mutant Massacre. They committed genocide against the mutants living under New York City, the subterranean civilization of the Morlocks. He then sent the marauders after Madeline Pryor, but the X-Men showed up, saving her, still unaware that the actual Jean Grey was with the X-Factor team. Though that failed, Sinister ended up kidnapping her son, Christopher Summers. Essex then sent Malice from the Marauders after Dazzler and Polaris, where Malice became stuck in Polaris's body. When the original Jean Grey finally returned, Sinister needed to kill off his clone Madeline Pryor, lest his scheme be discovered, so he sent the Marauders after her. They ended up shooting her, left her for dead, and stole her baby, which they brought to Sinister's orphanage. Cyclops wanted the baby he had with Pryor back, but then a demon named Asteer helped Pryor to recover her baby from Mr. Sinister, and this led to her becoming the Goblin Queen during an event called Inferno. Later, Cyclops and Jean went to the orphanage where Scott grew up and found Mr. Sinister's underground network of labs and scientific facilities, along with many children being held and tortured by Essex. This was the catalyst for Scott's real memories to start coming back. Sinister was now trying to bring Madeline Pryor back under his control, but her own power grew too much for him to control, though she did fall in battle to Jean Grey. Mr. Sinister then led the Marauders in an assault against both X-Factor and the X-Men, which resulted in the X-Men's mansion being obliterated. He managed to capture Jean Grey and reinsert his mental block into Scott's mind, preventing him from using his optic blasts again. He then told Scott his true history at the orphanage. Scott's brother Havoc, Alex Summers, tried to make Scott mad to force his powers back to the surface. It wasn't until he saw his love Jean Grey limp in Sinister's arms that his fury forced his mutant power out, and he destroyed Mr. Sinister in a massive blast from his eyes. Though a few years later, Sinister revealed that when he died, he was faking it in order to avoid having to fight both X-Men and X-Factor teams. He then reappeared in X-Factor, now leading a team called Nasty Boys. It was during this story that Sinister made himself into a U.S. senator to shame him in public, but that all didn't last long. In a 1990s event called Executioner's Song, where a clone of Cable's named Strife was wrecking havoc in the X-Men books, Strife actually gave Mr. Sinister a bioweapon called the Legacy Virus in exchange for Jean Grey and Cyclops, which would soon prove deadly for the X-Men. Mr. Sinister then met with Cable and Domino in a graveyard and goaded Cable even as Strife returned. In X-Men 23, Essex approached Cyclops and admitted to him that he'd screwed up and unleashed a terrible plague on mankind in the form of the Legacy Virus. This happened just as the Dark Riders showed up to fight Cyclops. He later used a lady named Threnody to help him find a cure, using her to track down mutants who had the Legacy Virus inside of them. Then, Games Master used Sienna Blaze to try to steal DNA from Proteus, but she failed, though when she reported back, Mr. Sinister was happy to find some of Phoenix's DNA under Sienna's fingernails, and so he took that DNA from her. After Gambit and Rogue kissed and they went haywire, Mr. Sinister appeared to Gambit to tell him that Essex would soon be calling in a favor with Gambit. During a story called The Trial of Gambit, Mr. Sinister hired the Raging Cajun Mutant to make a group of mercenaries and have them break into a community for him. In exchange, Sinister performed an operation on Gambit which allowed him to regain control of his powers. During the Age of Apocalypse storyline, Mr. Sinister became one of Apocalypse's horsemen. He was also working with Dark Beast to create an army of servants for Apocalypse called the Infinites. He also used Jean Grey's DNA to create a mutant named Nate Grey, aka X-Man. Sinister later attempted to trick Cable into joining him, so he disguised his Marauders as the emissaries of Apocalypse. They destroyed Disco Inferno and then Hell's Kitchen to draw Cable's attention. And when Cable inevitably fought Mr. Sinister, the Marauders managed to escape. This is around the same time that Gambit teamed up with Courier and Sabretooth to break into one of Mr. Sinister's labs where they discovered some cloning tanks that he used to grow his Marauders. Out up at the High Evolutionary's lab and told him he modified his system to not just target the X gene, but all humans on Earth to make an experiment on a giant scale in accelerated mutation. By X-Men 102, Sabretooth was working as Sinister's bodyguard, and he sent him after Domina, whose child had died when they removed all mutant powers on Earth. In 2003's Weapon X series, a pair of tween mutant siblings named Billy and Wendy were taken to a Weapon X internment camp called Camp Neverland, where Mr. Sinister was working under the name Dr. Windsor. He and his assistant Scalp Hunter were performing gruesome, horrific experiments on camp prisoners. At one point, he injected Wendy with a new and improved version of his N2 formula. Wendy suffered and seemingly died from the injection, awakened, and she was lifeless on the floor as red spikes and growths emerged from her body, but then she suddenly reawakened. Mr. Sinister continued on with his Geneva Convention violations. The Colossus Bloodline series talks about how Essex had feuded with Rasputin, and so Sinister had vowed to kill all of Rasputin's ancestors, Colossus included. Before he could wipe them out though, Peter and his brother Mikhail took the fight to Mr. Sinister. In X-Men 200, Mr. Sinister learned that after Scarlet Witch wiped out the mutant gene with her reality-altering No More Mutant spell on what came to be known as M-Day, that a new mutant child would be born, a Messiah child. Mr. Sinister quickly gathered his marauders to hunt down this baby, which we would learn her name to be Hope Summers. He even recruited a guy named Exodus and sent them after time travelers, psychics, and people who could see the future, so that included people like Cable. They even went to Emma Frost's place in Mississippi and stole Rogue, who had the Destiny Diaries in her mind, and brought her to Sinister. We then see that Mr. Sinister recreated Cerebro, and he used it to find the physical Destiny Diaries, and so he sent in the Marauders again, and again they battled the X-Men. In the fight, as Sinister tried to escape with the diary, it was destroyed while Gambit and Scalp Hunter were fighting. Mr. Sinister decided to move the baby to another location before the X-Men could find her, but little did he know a team of X-Men had already infiltrated his Antarctica stronghold. They wanted to rescue the baby and Rogue, who was still his prisoner. This was when Mystique and Exodus Legion of Marauders battled with Wolverine's X-Men team once more. Sinister was able to tie down Colossus, but the team learned that Cable had escaped with the baby to protect her. The Marauders ended up capturing the baby, Hope Summers, and went to Muir Island. And there Gambit handed the baby over to Mystique, who was posing as Mr. Sinister. And that night, Bishop and X-Force showed up on Muir Island to fight the Marauders. Another time, Mr. Sinister was making plans in case he were to die. So he picked Professor X, Juggernaut, and Sebastian Shaw as hosts for his consciousness. So when Mystique betrayed Mr. Sinister, and he did in fact die, he went into Professor X's body for a moment before Gambit and Shaw teamed up to destroy the transference machine that he called the Cronus device. When that failed, he used a backup to transfer into Claudine Renko, and thus for a while became Miss Sinister. Miss Sinister tried to manipulate Daken to kill his father Wolverine, but that failed, and Daken ended up stabbing Miss Sinister in the chest, and it looked like she died. In X-Men Spider-Man, we learned that Sinister had at one time hired Kraven the Hunter to get DNA from the original X-Men. He then mixed it with Kraven and Carnage's DNA to make a new monstrosity. Later, Sinister took over part of San Francisco and filled it with hundreds of clones of himself, an enclave of his superior selves, but that didn't last long as the X-Men moved in to stop him. It was a tough fight that led to Hope Summers shooting Sinister and a clone replacing him. Via the clone's hive mind, Sinister prevailed. By issue 17 of that series, Sinister was now in the mind of a lady named Kate Kildare, though another clone killed her and took her place. During A+X event, Mr. Sinister squared off against Kid Loki after he broke into one of Dr. Doom's Latverian labs to steal some samples. They teamed up to fight some monsters that came from Doom's stronghold. Sinister was using a gun that actually used Cyclops' cloned eyeballs to shoot optic blasts. That is until Kid Loki teleported them away to safety. In 2015, after Wolverine died and some people like X-23 and Daken were captured for their healing factors, Mr. Sinister showed up and ripped Daken apart, smashed X-23 through a wall, and stole Wolverine's entombed body after the wrecking crew that he'd hired failed. They then went to find Phantom L to break into Sinister's fortress to get Logan's body back. At the base, they fought with some Gripe servants and some other clones like Fin Fang Boom. This guy named Neuro told Sinister he could have control of the Wolverines if he cured them. Phantom L tried to escape from Sinister, and then Nightcrawler showed up to bamf away with the body. In Extraordinary X-Men, after Terrigen Mist were proving poisonous to mutants and Storm created the X-Haven Sanctuary in Magic's Limbo, Sinister once more took advantage of a dire situation. During one excursion to New York to look for Nightcrawler, Magic and her brother Colossus encountered Mr. Sinister in the sewers beneath the city. Magic was knocked out and her mystic defense of X-Haven fell when she blacked out, leaving it vulnerable to the Limbo demons around them. Sinister brought the siblings back to his lab where he and his marauders had other subjects tied up as he tested the Terrigen Mist effects, and he wanted to test Magic next. And he wanted to test Illyana Rasputin, Magic, next. That is until the X-Men showed up and Wolverine plunged his claws through Sinister's chest. This led to the X-Men battling the Marauders once again. He stumbled away, dispersing his Terrigen Mist and revealing he'd been testing on a clone of the recently dead Cyclops, proving he successfully combined mutant and Inhuman DNA. It ended when Magic removed Essex's head from his body with her soul sword. In the Secret Warriors book in 2018, we learned Mr. Sinister made a deal with Hydra to collect latent Inhumans that he could experiment on before they were exposed to Terrigen Mists. This group came to be called the Unhumans, and they kept them locked away at the Tower of Wisdom. The Secret Warriors attacked attacked the Tower of Wisdom to free them, along with an assist from Magic, who teleported a squad of Inhumans and Devil Dinosaur to the tower to fight. We later learned that Sinister had joined MODOK 2.0 and Mad Thinker as the new iteration of the Intelligentsia as they investigated Kid Kaiju, though they were later hunted down by the Champions team. In Iceman's 2018 series, Bobby Drake had to try to stop another mutant massacre, which led him to Mr. Sinister and the Foe Marauders team. Sinister kept attacking Iceman to prevent his efforts, leading to a showdown between the two in 2019's Iceman issue 5. In the Powers of X series, we learned that one of Sinister's clones ended up with the X gene, making Sinister a mutant instead of just a mutate, giving him access to the mutant sanctuary on Krakoa. This version of Mr. Sinister is much more fancy and foppish. He executed a clone for failing to give him a cape. He's more effete while retaining his loquacious nature. He's more charming, yet more deadly. Professor X and Magneto approached a clone at Bar Sinister to be granted an audience with Sinister Prime. They wanted him to catalog and save records of mutant DNA in the Bar Sinister library, except that happened to be a clone, and he got a bullet through his forehead by another clone. That one agreed with X and Magneto, and then Professor X used his powers to make Essex forget why he was cataloging mutant DNA. As such, Sinister joined the Krakoan governing body called the Quiet Council of Krakoa. After establishing Krakoan law, they banished Sabretooth to a pit and to stasis deep beneath Krakoa. He was exiled. After the Xeno Cabal attacked Krakoa, the council met in an emergency meeting, even while Xeno continued to hit some of the mutants' other facilities. Sinister's idea was just to hunt them down and kill them. He told Exodus that his shoulder ornamentation would not be outdone, just before the council questioned the Hellions team about their actions. Sinister advocated for the Hellions, saying their actions were justified and understandable. To make amends, Sinister and Psylocke tasked the Hellions team with going after the Essex state home for foundlings in Nebraska to destroy Sinister's old cloning farm, since it was now redundant, now with mutants' immortality and regeneration process in place. It was a simple hit job as Sinister's marauders were holed up inside, refusing calls to come to Krakoa. Complicating that, though, was that Goblin Queen was there too. When they got back, Nanny vowed to bring Sinister to justice for the atrocities she witnessed in Nebraska. In 2020's Fallen Angels, Mr. Sinister met with Psylocke at Bar Sinister, who was requesting passage out of Krakoa. They put together a team of Psylocke, X-23, and Cable. In a one-shot called Incoming, Sinister was beating on Longshot until Mojo would agree to provide Krakoa with a la carte TV programming. And then in Empire X-Men, Sinister was one of the Krakoans to go to Genosha to help out Magic and X-Corp. By Hellions issue 5, Essex was pushing for his Hellions to force the Iraqi into forfeit. Again, the council played into Sinister's hand. Sinister's Hellions were to march on Araco, but the catch was that Essex would lead them into battle. So Essex went back to Bar Sinister to make one of his clones go in his place. They actually played rock, paper, scissors to see who would get to keep the cape. The team went through the Avalon Gate to meet Sir Jamie Braddock to acquire a few horses for their journey. And when they broke through another gate to Araco, they encountered Tarn the Uncaring and demanded the 10 swords before the Tournament of Swords started. Tarn exposed Sinister's true mission to collect genomic DNA. Tarn and his Locust Vile team slaughtered the Hellions, but Sinister didn't care. Tarn started to rip Sinister apart, but they all escaped back through the portal, which is when Sinister killed his own team to prevent them from exposing his true mission. He then went back to the Quiet Council and pretended to be upset about it. Sinister was one of the council to vote for closing the gates like Avalon Gate, their portals around the world, for their safety. After the Tournament of Swords, the island of Araco sought to merge with Krakoa once more. The council wanted Sinister's insight on that, but he refused them. Later, Jamie Braddock came to Essex at Bar Sinister to cash in a favor to clone his sister. Then Essex met with Jason Wingard at Bar Sinister, and Jason ended up poisoning Sinister, who collapsed to the floor. He abducted Essex, and so the resurrected Hellions had to go try to find him. Wingard, aka Mastermind, had been manipulated by Arcade, and so the Hellions team ended up being trapped in their own nightmare. Sinister was trying to lead his clones at Bar Sinister with a lisp, trying to talk after a root canal. When Psylocke got her sword to Mastermind, Sinister showed up, and so did Arcade. The whole idea was to force Sinister to make clones for Arcade to use in Murder World. In the next issue, we see the pretentious and decadent Mr. Sinister and his garb that he was to wear for the Hellfire Gala, though he did appear on the next cover with sutures and sewn back together, yet another lifeless clone beneath his boot. He went back to Bar Sinister to dine with another Mr. Sinister and talk about the excursion. They started to fight, so Sinister hit a private alarm to summon his Hellions to his side, and he then revealed that he used the stolen Locust Vile DNA to make more clones, and now with the Hellions there, it was time for a rematch. The fight happened while the two Mr. Sinisters looked on. Tarn showed the Hellions how Essex had betrayed them, and they were about to attack when Essex activated an army of Mr. Sinister clones. And then Essex Prime escaped through a portal coded only to Essex DNA. The two Essexes that went through the gate portaled to a warehouse in New York City that was above Murder World. Tarn showed up and revealed Murder World wasn't destroyed, and then Psylocke said she'd been helping Sinister because he had her baby captive. And this reveal came just as Havoc blasted the place apart. The X-Men showed up, which meant Sinister's plot was exposed to the Quiet Council, and so he was held in his quarters. During the hearing, Psylocke attacked and bloodied Mr. Sinister, who became enraged, but he ended up being literally muzzled, so he'd shut the hell up for once. In Inferno, Professor X, Moira, and Magneto decided that to save mutants, that Mystique would have to be removed from power on the Quiet Council, and Destiny would need to be prevented from being resurrected, and so they reached out to Mr. Sinister to help make that happen. Mystique isn't stupid though, so as the council proposed a changing of the guard, she brought forth Destiny as a candidate, and then went to Bar Sinister disguised as Professor X to get the DNA vials, but he knew better and agreed to help her vote Destiny onto the council. When Charles, Moira, and Eric's plot was exposed, they were killed and resurrected, and the council was now fractured. In Immortal X-Men, we learned that Sinister might be getting his Bar Sinister Red Diamond news from the future by way of a bunch of Moira McTaggart clones who were stuck in cloning tanks. This while a big shakeup occurred on the council, with Magneto stepping down and both Hope Summers and Selene vying for a chair on the council. In the X-Men title, we meet a geneticist named Dr. Stasis, who is working as director of the Orchis 6 Petal Division, an organization fighting against the rise of mutant kind. It turns out that Dr. Stasis is actually another clone of Sinister's, one with a club on his forehead instead of a diamond, though both think themselves to be the original. There's also the matter of the Heart and Spade Sinisters, with clues leading to Mother Righteous and Orbis Stellaris as those versions. Club Sinister's also been working with Orchis and is responsible for getting the X-Men's resurrection secrets out to the world. Later, Essex injected himself with a mutant chimera formula and turned into a hulking beast to fight a kaiju on the coast of Krakoa to make everybody think that he was still helping. At the next council meeting, Sinister used his chimera power to look like Mystique, which pissed her off. Destiny later had a vision of all the mutants with Sinister diamonds on their head fighting, so she went to the council to warn them. Emma Frost then revealed to the council our first indication of the Sins of Sinister. Emma Frost then revealed to the council the identity of Dr. Stasis, aka Essex. Essex ran away, then sent a clone back to the council to look like he turned himself in, but at the last minute he was captured by the Eternals to help with a Celestial. Ajak and Makari of the Eternals brought the bound Sinister to Iron Man of the Avengers, where Sinister said he would help them awaken the Celestial to stop Druig's attack. Sinister recovered the shattered fragment of the heart of the dreaming Celestial to make a new Celestial named the Progenitor. Sinister activated Progenitor, knowing if he was judged and died that he would just be resurrected like the rest of the mutants. After Judgment Day was over, Sinister went back to the Quiet Council on Krakoa, and he was about to kill Hope Summers, but Destiny spoke up and so they killed Sinister first. And then Essex kept using the Moira timelines and failing to kill the council each time, but he ended up murdering Emma Frost, Storm, Professor Xavier, Hope Summers, and Exodus of the Quiet Council. Destiny, Kate Pryde, and the X-Men then vowed to hunt Mr. Sinister down, leading into 2023's Sins of Sinister, where he's caught by Cable and brought to justice, ultimately being banished to the pit. That's when he escaped from the pit and activated his clones. We see many sinisterized versions, including a Captain America and other X-Men, even Rasputin 4. He's combining mutant DNA into new beings, chimeras, that he can send after the X-Men to do his bidding. The event shows Mr. Sinister's reality at 10 years in, 100 years in, and 1,000 years in. You can see Mr. Sinister is truly sinister, and he's touched all parts of the Marvel Universe, affecting every corner for his own purpose, and he will continue to do so as we move into the future. And with that, that's a wrap on this one, my friends. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.